Imagine women dedicating their entire lives to caring for people with leprosy, a disease so feared many wouldn't even go near them. Picture nuns running massive hospitals, some with hundreds of beds, centuries before modern medicine. These women even brewed beer, not for parties, but because it was often safer to drink than water for the poor and sick they served. Some nuns defied expectations by living in independent communities, making their own rules to help those in need, without direct oversight from male clergy for a time. These weren't just background figures. They were powerhouses of compassion in a tough world. Get ready to learn about some seriously amazing medieval nuns. Number 7. The Sisters of the Common Life, educating the future, one girl at a time. Ever heard of a movement that was all about living a simple, devout life, kind of like the earliest Christians? That was the vibe of the Devotio Moderna, or modern devotion, which popped up in the late 14th century in the Netherlands. And guess what? Women were a huge part of it, forming communities known as the Sisters of the Common Life. These weren't your typical nuns locked away in cloisters with super strict vows, at least not always at first. Many lived in shared houses, supporting themselves through honest work, like spinning, weaving, or copying books. And a big part of their mission: charity, especially through education. Think about it. In the medieval world, education for girls, particularly poor girls, wasn't exactly a top priority for most. But the Sisters of the Common Life saw things differently. They believed that a good, pious life started with understanding, and they opened schools for girls who otherwise would have had no chance to learn. They taught reading, writing, and religious instruction, giving these young women tools for life and faith. It was a quiet revolution, empowering girls through knowledge. But their charity didn't stop at schooling. Living in urban areas, they were right in the middle of everyday struggles. They would care for the sick in their communities, offering what comfort and aid they could. They shared their earnings with the poor, practicing the very simplicity and generosity they preached. Imagine a group of women, not bound by ironclad monastic rules, but by a shared desire to live a good life and help others, making a real difference in their towns. They also played a vital role in the spread of knowledge by meticulously copying manuscripts. This wasn't just for religious texts. It helped preserve and disseminate learning. So, while they prayed and worked with their hands, they were also contributing to the intellectual life of their time, often making books more accessible. The Sisters of the Common Life might not have run giant hospitals or commanded vast estates, but their impact was profound. They fostered a spirituality that was personal, practical, and deeply charitable, focusing on the everyday needs of people around them, especially the young and vulnerable. They showed that charity could be about quiet, dedication, practical skills, and opening doors to a better future through education. It was a powerful form of service, deeply rooted in their desire to live a life that truly reflected their faith. These women were community builders, educators, and caregivers, all rolled into one, driven by a shared spiritual path. Number 6. Augustinian Canonesses, regular hospitallers of the mercy of Jesus, angels of the sick ward. Okay, get this. There was an order of nuns specifically dedicated to rolling up their sleeves and working in hospitals, day in and day out. We're talking about the Augustinian Canonesses, regular hospitallers of the mercy of Jesus. That's a mouthful. But their mission was clear. Show mercy, especially to the sick. Their story often starts in Dieppe, France, way back in the 13th century, though their roots might go even deeper. These women weren't just praying for the sick from afar. They were with them. They lived by the rule of St. Augustine, which emphasized community and service, and they took that service straight to the bedsides of the suffering. Imagine a medieval hospital. It's not the sterile, high-tech place we know today. It was often crowded, resources were limited, and medical knowledge was, well, medieval. Yet, these Augustinian nuns were there providing care that was both physical and spiritual. They would have been responsible for feeding patients, changing linens, cleaning wounds, and administering whatever remedies were available, often herbal concoctions grown in their own gardens. They also offered prayers, comfort, and a compassionate presence, which, in a world with few cures, was incredibly important. They saw Christ in every sick person they tended. This wasn't just a job. It was a sacred calling. Their dedication meant they often faced immense risks, especially during outbreaks of plague or other contagious diseases. While others might flee, these nuns often stayed, continuing their work amidst a lot of danger. One of their most famous legacies is their role in establishing hospitals in the New World. When French colonists went to Canada, these Augustinian hospitallers went with them, founding the Hôtel Dieu de Québec in 1639. This wasn't just any hospital, it was the first one in North America, north of Mexico. Think about the courage that took crossing an ocean to a new, unfamiliar land to build a place of healing from scratch. They brought their expertise, their compassion, and their unwavering commitment. The records from places like the Hôtel Dieu de Québec give us a glimpse into their incredible work. They dealt with everything from injuries sustained in the wilderness to diseases brought over from Europe, and they cared for both settlers and indigenous peoples. They were not just nurses. They were administrators, pharmacists, and spiritual guides. They built institutions that lasted for centuries, laying the groundwork for healthcare systems. These Augustinian hospitallers weren't afraid of hard work or difficult situations. Their entire lives were structured around this mission of mercy. They took vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and a special fourth vow, service to the poor and sick. This fourth vow was the heart of their identity. They lived it, breathed it, and through their tireless efforts, brought comfort and care to thousands upon thousands of people who had nowhere else to turn. They were true pioneers in healthcare, driven by a profound sense of compassion. Number 5. Benedictine nuns, the original powerhouses of prayer and practicality. When you think of medieval monks and nuns, the Benedictines probably come to mind. Ora et labora. Prayer and work, that was their motto. And boy, did they live it? Founded way back in the 6th century by Saint Benedict of Nursia with his twin sister, Saint Scholastica, often seen as the founder of the women's branch, Benedictine monasteries and nunneries spread like wildfire across Europe. And while prayer was central, their work often translated into some serious charitable action. Benedictine nunneries were often significant landowners. This wasn't about personal wealth for the nuns, it was about creating self-sufficient communities that could also support others. From these lands, they would harvest food, raise livestock, and generate income. And what did they do with the surplus? A lot of it went to charity. A key feature of many Benedictine houses was the almonry. This was basically the charity department run by an almoner, often a nun in a nunnery, responsible for distributing aid to the poor. This wasn't just spare change. It could be daily distributions of food, bread, soup, old clothes, and sometimes small amounts of money. For people living on the edge of survival, and there were many in the medieval period, the local Benedictine nunnery could be a lifeline. Then there was hospitality. The rule of Saint Benedict is very specific about welcoming guests, especially pilgrims and the poor, as if they were Christ himself. Benedictine nunneries often had guest houses where travelers could find a safe place to rest and a meal. In an age with few inns, especially for poorer folk, this was a vital service. Imagine a weary pilgrim miles from home, finding a welcoming light and a warm bed at a nunnery. Many Benedictine nunneries also maintained infirmaries. While primarily for their own sick or elderly sisters, these infirmaries often extended care to people from the local community, especially if there wasn't another hospital nearby. The nuns would have used herbal remedies, many grown in their own meticulously kept gardens, and provided nursing care. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, a famous Benedictine abbess, were renowned for their knowledge of medicine and healing herbs. Alongside their music and mystical vision, while Hildegard was exceptional, the tradition of healing was strong in many Benedictine communities. Beyond direct aid, Benedictine nuns contributed to society by preserving knowledge. They copied manuscripts, not just religious texts, but also classical literature, keeping learning alive through turbulent times. Some nunneries became centers of education, particularly for girls from noble families, but sometimes also for those less fortunate. The stability and organization of the Benedictine order allowed them to undertake long-term charitable projects. They weren't just reacting to crises. They built sustainable systems of aid. Their life of prayer fueled their work, and their work put their faith into action. For centuries, Benedictine nuns were quiet, consistent forces of charity, managing resources, caring for the needy, and offering sanctuary in a world that was often harsh and unpredictable. They were the bedrock of monastic charity. Number 4. The Brigittines. Double the devotion, double the hospitality. Ever heard of a monastery that had both monks and nuns living there? Sounds a bit scandalous for the medieval period, but Saint Bridget of Sweden made it happen with her Order of the Most Holy Savior, better known as the Brigittines. Founded in the 14th century, these weren't just any communities. They were designed with a unique structure and a strong emphasis on thoughtful charity. Saint Bridget was a Swedish noblewoman, a mystic and a mother before she became a foundress. She received visions that guided her in establishing her order, and one key aspect was this idea of double monasteries. Now, don't get the wrong idea. The monks and nuns lived in strictly separate enclosures within the same larger monastic complex. They shared a church, but even there, they were kept apart. The community was ultimately governed by an abbess, which was pretty progressive. So, where does the charity come in? Saint Bridget's rule for her order, the Regula Salvatoris, Rule of the Savior, laid out specific provisions for helping others. Brigittine houses were often large and, thanks to royal patronage and careful management, relatively well off. This allowed them to practice hospitality on a significant scale. pilgrims were a big focus. Medieval Europe was full of people traveling to holy shrines, and these journeys could be long and dangerous. Brigittine monasteries were specifically instructed to provide for pilgrims, offering them food, shelter, and spiritual comfort. They were like divinely ordained rest stops on the often perilous medieval highways. But it wasn't just pilgrims. The poor were also explicitly mentioned in their rule. Part of the monastery's income was to be set aside for alms. This meant regular distributions of food and other necessities to the local needy. Imagine a well-organized system where the monastery acted as a social safety net for the surrounding community. Brigittine nuns and monks were also dedicated to a life of contemplation and study, and they produced and copied manuscripts, and their libraries were often impressive. While this might not seem like direct charity in the way feeding the hungry is, preserving knowledge and fostering a learned environment had long-term benefits for society. The life inside a Brigittine monastery was highly structured. The nuns were primarily dedicated to prayer and contemplation, their lives revolving around the daily office. The monks, fewer in number, often served as chaplains and helped with the heavier manual labor and administration of the estates that supported the charitable works. The influence of the Brigittines spread from Sweden across Europe, with notable houses in England. Sine Abbey was a big one, Italy, and beyond. Each of these houses would have been a center of prayer, learning, and, importantly, practical charity. Saint Bridget herself was known for her personal acts of charity, even before founding the order, and she infused that spirit into its DNA. The Brigittines show us a different model of monastic charity, one that was carefully planned, well-resourced, and integrated into a unique community structure. They balanced a deep contemplative life with a real tangible commitment to easing the burdens of pilgrims and the poor, all under the guidance of a remarkable woman founder. Number 3. The Poor Clares. Radical poverty, rich in compassion. Imagine choosing to own absolutely nothing. No personal belongings, no vast lands, no guaranteed income. That's the radical path chosen by Saint Clare of Assisi and her followers, the Poor Clares. Founded in the early 13th century, these women were the female counterparts to Saint Francis and his Franciscan friars, and they took the vow of poverty to an extreme, all in the name of following Christ more closely. So, if they were so poor, how could they be charitable? It's a good question. Their charity wasn't always about handing out material goods, because often they had very little to give. Instead, their charity was multifaceted. First, there was the power of their example. In a society often obsessed with wealth and status, the Poor Clares offered a stunning countercultural witness. They showed that a life rich in faith didn't require material riches. This itself could be a profound comfort and inspiration to the poor, who saw women often from noble or wealthy families willingly embrace a life of hardship out of love for God. Second, their primary work was prayer. Poor Clares lived an enclosed, contemplative life, meaning they rarely left their convents. They dedicated their days and nights to praying for the world, for the church, for sinners, and especially for those in need. In medieval understanding, this intercessory prayer was a powerful form of spiritual charity, seen as just as vital, if not more so, than material aid. They were spiritual warriors fighting battles with prayer. But it wasn't all just prayer. To support their very basic needs, the nuns engaged in manual labor. They would spin, weave, do fine needlework, or make altar breads. Sometimes, if they produced more than they needed for their own austere existence, the surplus could be given to the even poorer people outside their walls, or the items they made could be sold to raise funds for alms. Their foundress, Saint Clare herself, was known for her personal care of sick sisters within the convent and for her deep humility. While the ideal was to live on alms given freely to them, often provided by the local community or Franciscan friars who begged on their behalf, poor Clare monasteries, by their very presence, often became focal points of local piety. People would come to their gates seeking prayers or spiritual counsel. And though they aimed for strict poverty, sometimes local communities would ensure the nuns had enough so that they, in turn, could offer small kindnesses to the destitute who came knocking. The privilege of poverty granted to Santar by the Pope was unique. It meant they had the right to own nothing, not even communally, relying entirely on God's providence. This was a tough road. There were times of real hardship for many poor Clare communities. Yet, their commitment to this ideal was unwavering. Their charity, then, was deeply spiritual and relational. It was about solidarity with the poor through their own chosen poverty. It was about offering the powerful gift of prayer. It was about living a life that challenged worldly values and pointed towards heavenly ones. And in their quiet, hidden way, through their labor and their reliance on divine providence, they still found ways to share what little they had. The poor Clares teach us that charity isn't just about money. It's about love, sacrifice, and a profound connection to the human family, especially its most vulnerable members. Number 2. Hospitaller nuns of places like the Hôtel Dieu de Paris, frontline heroes of medieval Chasseurs. Picture this: Paris, the heart of medieval Europe. And right near the famous Notre Dame Cathedral stands the Hôtel Dieu, one of the oldest continuously running hospitals in the world, founded centuries before. Who is keeping this massive institution going day in and day out, caring for the city's sick, poor, and abandoned? Primarily, it was communities of nuns, often Augustinian Canonesses. These weren't just any nuns. They were dedicated hospitallers, meaning their entire lives were devoted to the service of the sick. The Hôtel Dieu wasn't a small clinic. It could house hundreds of patients at a time, often in large communal wards, and the conditions, let's just say germ theory, was a long way off. Beds might be shared by multiple patients, hygiene was a constant struggle, and diseases spread easily. These nuns weren't just caregivers. They were also administrators. They managed the hospital's resources, oversaw staff, if any lay helpers were employed, and dealt with the practicalities of running such a large institution. They relied on donations, endowments, and sometimes income from hospital-owned properties to keep things afloat. Think of the personal risks they took. During epidemics, like the devastating Black Death, these nuns were on the front lines. While many who could fled plague-stricken cities, the hospitaller nuns often stayed, continuing to care for the dying, knowing they themselves were highly likely to contract the disease. Chronicles from the time speak of entire communities of nursing sisters being wiped out only to be replaced by new recruits ready to face the same dangers. That's dedication. Their lives were governed by a monastic rule, usually that of St. Augustine, which emphasized communal living, prayer, and service. Their vow of hospitality or service to the sick was the defining characteristic of their vocation. They renounced personal possessions, marriage, and their own will to dedicate themselves wholly to this demanding work. The Hôtel Dieu de Paris is just one example, though a very famous one. Similar hospital communities run by nuns existed in many other cities across Europe. They formed a vital part of the social fabric, offering care to those who often had no one else: the poor, the traveler, the pilgrim, the outcast. These women weren't just performing a job, they were living a radical form of Christian charity, putting their lives on the line daily to ease suffering and embody compassion. They were, in many ways, the unsung heroes of medieval healthcare. Number 1. The Beguines, the trailblazing women who redefined charity on their own terms. Get ready for a group of women who totally broke the mold in medieval times. The Beguines. These weren't nuns in the traditional sense. They didn't take lifelong solemn vows, and they weren't part of a formal religious order approved by Rome, at least not initially. Instead, they were laywomen who chose to live together in communities, dedicating themselves to a life of piety, prayer, and, crucially, hands-on charitable work. And they were everywhere, especially in the Low Countries. Think Belgium and the Netherlands. Germany and France, starting around the 12th century. So, what made them so special? Their independence was a big deal. In an era when women's lives were often strictly controlled by family or the church, Beguines carved out a unique space for themselves. They lived in communities called biguinages. Sometimes these were just a few houses. Other times they were like entire walled towns within towns, complete with their own churches, infirmaries, and workshops. The Grand Beguinage of Leuven, for example, is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, giving you an idea of their scale. Within these communities, Beguines lived simple lives. They didn't renounce personal property entirely, though many lived very modestly, and they were free to leave the beguinage if they chose to marry, for instance. This flexibility was pretty radical. Their charitable work was incredibly diverse and deeply practical. Because they lived in urban centers, they were right there, seeing the needs of the people around them. And they responded. Many Beguines became skilled nurses, caring for the sick and the elderly. Some beguinages ran their own small hospitals or infirmaries, serving the local poor. They would visit the sick in their homes, bringing food, medicine, often herbal remedies they prepared themselves, and comfort. They were also educators. Beguines often ran schools for girls, teaching them reading, writing, and practical skills like needlework or spinning. This was especially important for poorer girls who wouldn't have had other educational opportunities. By equipping these girls with skills, they were giving them a better chance in life. To support themselves and their charitable activities, Beguines worked. They were known for their skills in textile industries, spinning wool, weaving cloth, doing fine lacework or embroidery. The income from this work helped maintain their communities and fund their aid to the poor. This self-sufficiency was another hallmark of their independence. They weren't just relying on donations. They were actively contributing to their own upkeep and their charitable missions. The spiritual life of Beguines was intense. They were part of a broader movement of lay piety that emphasized a personal relationship with God and practical Christian living. Many famous mystics, like Hedwig of Antwerp and Meckfield of Magdeburg, were Beguines, writing powerful spiritual texts. Their deep faith was the engine driving their charitable actions. However, their independence sometimes brought them under suspicion from church authorities. A movement of women living autonomously, interpreting scripture, and engaging in active ministry without direct clerical oversight could be seen as challenging. Some Beguines faced accusations of heresy, and at times the movement faced fractangs. But it persevered for centuries, adapting and evolving. The Beguines were truly remarkable. They created a new way for women to live a devout and active life in the world. They combined contemplation with action, prayer with practical service. They built supportive communities, cared for the vulnerable, educated the young, and supported themselves through their own labor. They were innovators, social workers, nurses, teachers, and spiritual seekers, all rolled into one. Their legacy is a testament to the power of women organizing to meet human needs with compassion and creativity, often right on the front lines of poverty and sickness in medieval cities. They didn't just talk about charity, they lived it every single day on their own terms.